So I wanted to share some of the really amazing things that have taken place around the world in the last couple of years. Because if you focus just on the headlines, it can get easy to be pretty depressed. Because a lot of the things that are happening in our culture at the moment, and I'm not going to get into all of that this evening due to my orders to stick to good news, but it's easy when you're reading the headlines to get a bit depressed and to feel a bit overwhelmed by how much cultural power the opposition seems to have. And one of the things that I find most interesting, and I'm going to talk about this a bit at the end of the presentation as well, is the contrast between what we find on the ground, having discussions about abortion in front of high schools, on campuses, going door to door in the public, and the political conversation. Because if you just pay attention to the political conversation about abortion in Canada, you would very much get the impression that to bring up abortion is the kiss of death for any Canadian politician. You would get the idea that the Canadian public is lockstep behind this abortion regime we have in place, where of course babies can be aborted up until birth. Babies are dying after birth, after abortions have failed, and our politicians will do nothing. And the media narrative is that if you speak to that, if you point out the fact that this is taking place, you will lose votes and you will lose popularity. But at our organization, as you'll be hearing quite a bit about tomorrow morning, we've been going door to door, and we've been going door to door in neighborhoods where people vote for Justin Trudeau en masse. And at almost every single doorstep, we find people who are on our side on this issue almost entirely. And further to that, they are stunned when they find out that Canada actually has an abortion regime where babies can be aborted up until birth. I'll give you one little fact on that. During this election campaign, Justin Trudeau consistently said, you know what, the majority of the Canadian public is on our side, by which he meant preserving this regime where we have no abortion restrictions whatsoever. And in order for him to say this, he had to be either ignorant or intentionally ignoring all of the polling data that we have, because the polls tell us that 80% of Canadians, a full 80%, are completely unaware that we have no abortion laws. And we have found going door to door that people are so stunned when we tell them that we have no abortion laws that they'll Google it on their phones while we're talking to them because they don't believe this is actually the case. The majority of the Canadian public thinks that abortion is restricted somewhere around 14 weeks. So when Justin Trudeau says that Canadians support the abortion status quo, you can understand that he's referring to a group of Canadians who think a law he opposes is already in place. And that this is very obviously not the scenario that he wants to be discussing. And they're not all dumb when it comes to this issue, because they are in full recognition of the fact that if we in this room, if the pro-life movement in Canada at large succeed in informing people what the status quo actually is, sharing with them the details of what abortion does to preborn children, pointing out the fact that we are the only democracy in the world with no restrictions on abortion, that they will be outraged by that fact. And one of the key pieces of evidence that we have for this, and this is probably one of the most ridiculous things that's happened in the last 2 years, and there's plenty of competition, is Mike Shooten, you know, We Need a Law, is one of the sponsors of this conference, and they had put these billboards up right across Canada. I saw one of them like 10 minutes from my house in Ontario that said, "Canada has no abortion laws." Right? Just a simple statement of fact. No pictures like we use, no controversial messaging, not even a statement of fact like abortion is wrong or abortion kills a human being. Just Canada has no abortion laws. And the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada had an incredible meltdown and went to Ad Standards Canada to get these billboards taken down. A simple statement of fact that is not only not controversial, but actually reflects the status quo that they want to support in the first place. So why do you think that they're so desperate to ensure that a simple, non-controversial legal fact be taken off of billboards, despite the fact that the sentence doesn't even say anything about whether or not abortion is moral? It's because they know that their continued success depends on the 80% of Canadians who are unaware that there is no abortion law continuing to remain unaware, that as long as Canadians are ignorant about abortion, in darkness about what the procedure does, that is the only way they can maintain the stranglehold they have on the abortion debate in the public square. And that's why it's so important for us in this room to realize that despite what the media says, when you go door to door, when you talk to Canadians on the streets, they are not only opposed to the status quo, they are stunned to find out what the status quo is. And that we should see as an opportunity and as a challenge. I have personally seen hundreds of people change their minds after very simple conversations about abortion. The thing that irritates me the most is when people come up to us and say, we could never do what you do. That's not true. It's not nearly as hard as you think, and what has deceived you into thinking their arguments are sophisticated, intelligent, or scientific? They're not. This is not very difficult because the truth has been the same for 40 years. They haven't caught up with science on the issue, and that's why it's up to us to get out there and not just talk to each other in rooms like this, but talk to pro-choice people who disagree with us, because we can make people pro-life. I see it every day. That's my little note here on Canada, and I'll add another plug for some of the things I think we should be doing at the end. But I want to shift south of the border in discussing what's going on that's good. And while I'll give you just a couple of numbers, this is a video, a time warp video of the March for Life this February, where hundreds of thousands of people showed up from across the country. I've been to the March for Life in the United States several times, and it's a pretty incredible experience to be out there in the capital city with over 250,000 people who all believe the exact same thing as you and have showed up in weather like that. And I promise you, it is freezing cold, because it always happens in January, of course, because that's the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the decision that legalized abortion. But the number of people that are putting boots on the ground specifically to defend preborn human rights just south of the border is pretty incredible. And in fact, one of the reasons the abortion discussion cropped up during our election cycle is because of the gains that they're making down there. Most of you probably already know this, but I think one of the most encouraging pieces of news we got this year from south of the border is that the abortion rate is now the lowest it has been since 1973, when abortion was first legalized. Now, we've had the opportunity at CCBR to work with a lot of different American groups. They work on taking a look at what we do and using it over there, and vice versa, trying to understand which tactics are the most effective in reaching the culture. And one of the things that I find really interesting over there is that although on many cultural fronts, and I'm not going to go too far down the depressing rabbit hole, but on many cultural fronts, social conservatives are losing, the one issue where we are not giving ground, and in the United States specifically are gaining ground, is the abortion issue. In fact, it's almost an aberration in some ways. And I spoke with Scott Klusendorf, who wrote the original apologetics book, Pro-Life 101, as well as The Case for Life. And he says it's unbelievable to the pro-choice activists that thought this was going to be over the day after Roe v. Wade was declared. It was finished, they'd won, everybody could go home now because they'd won the abortion fight. And instead of that happening, we've seen a massive sea change with every single year since 1991, when Gallup started doing polling on this issue, more and more Americans have called themselves pro-life, and fewer Americans have called themselves pro-choice, to the point where, and this was my favorite thing actually, in 2015, Planned Parenthood launched a marketing campaign to start moving away from the phrase pro-choice, because not enough Americans wanted to identify with the term, because the pro-life movement had so successfully stigmatized the abortion procedure. And in fact, a couple of major abortion leaders in the movement, one of them who's the executive director of the largest political lobby group supporting abortion in the US, when they were asked by the media why they were losing so badly, why year over year over year they were losing ground, they told the LA Times, and I quote directly from the article, "In recent years, the anti-abortion movement has successfully put the nitty-gritty details of abortion on public display, increasing the belief that abortion is serious business and that some societal involvement is appropriate." In other words, what the American abortion movement was saying is that when Americans come face to face with what abortion actually is, they begin to reject abortion, because the entire pro-choice strategy is to deflect from the issue at hand, right? They say pro-choice. Well, we're all pro-choice about some stuff and anti-choice about other stuff. They always say it's the woman's right to choose, which is an incomplete sentence. If I asked you guys if you supported the men's right to choose, you'd probably want to know what they were choosing before you decided whether or not you'd support that statement. And the exact same thing is true with the abortion debate. When the pro-life movement successfully finishes the sentence that the pro-choice movement has been using quite brilliantly since the early 70s. We see people reject that choice because they recognize they've been lied to about what this is. I'll give you just a couple of more numbers from the United States that I've found very, very encouraging, and the media immediately after these numbers came out tried to claim that the reason the abortion rate was dropping had nothing to do with the pro-life movement. It had everything to do with Obama's support for contraception or whatever. So I actually emailed one of the top statisticians, pro-life statisticians in the United States. He has degrees from Stanford and Yale, and he's been studying this issue for most of his professional life. And here's what he sent me by email. He said, the news is good for pro-lifers because America's abortion decline is continuing, and their data shows that the abortion rate fell by 20% between 2011 and 2017. Furthermore, the abortion decline is widespread as the abortion rate fell in 45 of 50 American states, and overall the U.S. abortion rate has fallen by over 53% since 1980. Now, and as I mentioned earlier, the U.S. abortion rate is now lower than what it was in 1973, which is the year of the Roe v. Wade decision. And he tracks exactly how these shifts started to take place. But one of the data points I think that's very encouraging that we should take a look at, especially because we have a radically pro-choice government, just as the American pro-life movement did after Barack Obama was elected twice. What they accomplished during Barack Obama's tenure, I think, is incredibly encouraging. They were on the ground nonstop, reaching people, talking to people, ensuring that the work they were doing went on, even when they didn't hold the reins of power. They worked on the state level, and more than 400 pro-life laws have passed state legislatures since Barack Obama got elected, hugely contributing to the massive drop in the abortion rate. Further to that, just since the beginning of this year, since 2019 started, over 250 pro-life laws have been tabled in 41 of 50 states across the United States. They don't pay any attention to whether or not they hold the reins of power. The movement is there, it's relentless, and they know that they have to build the culture in order to affect public policy, because when you have that many people show up in the Capitol, even those who don't feel like listening end up listening. So that's the United States, and if anybody wants even more details on how incredible things are, at least for the moment, I'd be happy to share those during Q&A. But I want to move on briefly to the one major loss of last year, and that was the loss of the Republic of Ireland, where abortion was legalized by referendum. I was actually there with my wife, my daughter, and two of my colleagues. We were working with Life Institute and Youth Defense for several weeks, and my daughter Charlotte actually ended up in the newspaper. So that was pretty neat, and their movement there is just incredible. And there's this storyline emerging from what happened in Ireland on May 25th of last year, and people are saying, look, what happened here is that this country finally moved away from its Catholic roots, finally rejected the reactionary views that they'd had, and moved towards a more pro-choice point of view. And the alternative story there, which I think is incredibly inspiring, is that for 35 years, the Irish pro-life movement did something that almost no other movement has accomplished, kept abortion out through absolutely incredible strategizing, and saved 250,000 babies in the process. So while it is a tragedy that the Irish public voted, well, a minority of them if you look at the exit data, but nevertheless, a majority of the people who voted for abortion. The storyline that emerges from this should not forget what the Irish pro-life movement accomplished. I was talking to one of my friends there. He's one of the doctors who worked on the Savita case after that broke, and he said, what was it all for? And I said, you guys saved 250,000 babies in 35 years. And he said, yeah, that's a good reminder. Another good reminder is that 2018 was seen by a lot of pro-lifers as kind of a write-off because it was a genuinely heartbreaking loss to see Ireland vote in abortion. It really, really was, especially because we knew at that point that Northern Ireland would be soon to follow, and the only countries now left in Europe that have explicitly pro-life laws are Malta and Liechtenstein, which I bet most of you haven't heard of. And of course, you have other European countries who are now pushing in much more effective laws in places like Poland. But one of the things that's important to recognize about 2018 is a lot of people think that the only major international battle over abortion was in Ireland, and that we lost that one. But actually, of the countries that tried to legalize abortion last year, the vast majority of them shut down abortion and did so by a wide margin. So the first example I'll give you is El Salvador. Many people didn't notice this. This fight was going on the same month the referendum campaign was being fought in Ireland. And almost all of the international forces were focusing on El Salvador and trying to push abortion through. Amnesty International, the United Nations, you name it, International Planned Parenthood, they were pouring a ton of cash, and the entire media, BBC, CNN, all of the major news corporations were lining up behind the abortion movement, publishing these columns about how El Salvador was a cruel and wicked place where preborn children were protected in the womb. And so this campaign was going on full tilt, and it actually very much looked like the abortion activists were going to succeed in their campaign to get abortion legalized there. And at the last moment, the legislators actually voted against it. And the El Salvadorian organization Young People for Life, this was their quote when the law failed. They said, "We're celebrating that abortion was not legalized in this legislature, and during the 3 years the abortionists dedicated themselves to bombard us with media campaigns in favor of abortion, we managed to win in the end." And the interesting thing is that the BBC and CNN and the New York Times all called this a crushing defeat. And when I read articles like that, any of you who have seen images of abortion and know what abortion is, the real crushing defeat would have been to see that practice arrive in El Salvador. And so when the New York Times is upset about something, you can probably take it to the bank that you should be in a good mood that day, even if you're not familiar totally with the story. So El Salvador, this happened the same month that the Irish referendum was going on, and most people didn't even hear about it. There's another incredible victory, and this story was really inspiring. I spoke with leaders of 3 of the major organizations down in Argentina. And the abortion activists and their political supporters, a lot of them being the communists, were moving to legalize abortion. And they were doing an incredible job because, again, they've got all the free advertising they want because they've got the mainstream media. You've got all of these organizations that essentially function as lackeys of Marie Stopes International or Planned Parenthood International. And they were turning all of their fire on getting the Argentinian Senate to vote in legal abortion. And here's what's interesting is they underestimated the power of grassroots activism in Argentina, and further to that, they underestimated just how pro-life the Argentinian people were. The Argentinian organizations got together, they gathered all the different denominations of Christians, and they announced that they were going to take to the streets to protest the planned legalization of abortion. And I'm going to before I tell you how many of them there were, I'm going to show you a video clip of what that march looked like. So roughly 3.8 million people took to the streets. And you'll notice a lot of them are carrying the blue kerchief. That's become the sign of pro-life defiance right across South America and Latin America. It's been pretty cool to see. The abortion activists adopted the color green as their color. And so in response, the Argentinians first selected blue and the blue kerchief, and the other countries have followed. It's now become a theme right across Latin America. But as a result of people marching, when the vote came down to it in the Senate, the abortion activists lost by just a handful of votes. Just a handful of votes. And here's another video clip. This is one of my favorites. 38 senators voted against legalizing abortion, and 31 voted in favor of it, so it was very close. And there were hundreds of thousands of pro-lifers packing Buenos Aires for the vote. And this vote was going on long into the night, after midnight. Actually, I don't know exactly what time it was there because I was up watching the vote as well, because I was really worried that, that they were going to legalize it there. And everybody was outside the legislature, and they were all watching these screens. And when the moment that the vote tally finally went up and the pro-lifers realized they won, this is what that looks like. I don't think I've ever been that happy. One of the things I think that's coolest about this video that we often miss is when you see these people that are celebrating the fact that abortion got defeated, they're celebrating the fact that other people's babies aren't going to die as a result of abortion. Right? There's so many people who say, mind your own business. That would be easy for pro-life activists to do. It would be easy just to go home. If we're pro-life, our kids are safe, so we don't have to worry about it. So to see these millions of people taking to the streets and to see the genuine joy on these people's faces when they're celebrating, it always warms my heart to see, because the pro-life movement is honestly the most beautiful movement anybody can be a part of. Because people are sacrificing not just for their own families and not just for their own children, but for other people's children. And that's one of the reasons I always find these celebratory videos so encouraging. The first one you saw of the march, I think my 2-year-old knows the tune by heart. I watched it so many times when it first came out. So it wasn't actually just Argentina and just El Salvador. In September of 2018, the same thing happened in Guatemala. There was a proposed bill that was put forward to loosen restrictions on abortion. And abortion activists, again, thought this was going to kind of sail through. And it's easy to figure out why you'd think that. If you read the mainstream media, and I'd read a lot of the international reporting, like from the BBC prior to this bill in Guatemala, and from their perspective, this is obviously going to pass. It's obviously a just bill. And you've got all of the elite organizations, right, like the various wings of the UN and all of that are expressing their support for this legislation. And so they're always stunned when the public finally discovers what they're up to and comes out and starts protesting it. So this is one of my favorite stories, because this was more of an impromptu march. It was less organized. But when the pro-lifers found out that an abortion bill was going to pass, loosening restrictions, the pro-life leaders and the bishops and the pastors all put out a call to march on Guatemala City and host a massive demonstration. And it was pretty last minute. It wasn't as incredibly well organized as the Argentinian march. But despite that, it's being taken from a drone. Sorry for the noise. So over 20,000 people showed up impromptu in Guatemala City to protest the legislation. And when the politicians realized that it was going to be their voters over against the United Nations Population Fund, they pulled the bill and decided not to go through with it after all. So that was a third victory. These are all within just a couple of months. And most people I find haven't heard of all the amazing things that did actually happen last year. Another example would be in the Dominican Republic, where there was a bill put forward to legalize abortion in a handful of places. And just like in Guatemala, just like, in Argentina, a whole bunch of pro-life activists showed up. They hosted this massive rally. You can see they're all adopting the blue bandana, the blue kerchief, that the blue wave is what they're calling it now, that started in Argentina. And as a result of this, the legislators in the Dominican Republic also backed down, and abortion remains illegal in the Dominican Republic. Another story, and this also happened in September of 2018, this was happening in 3 countries simultaneously. The abortion activists were seeking to recruit a lot of support among the politicians, especially among the socialists and the communists there, to legalize abortion in Chile. It's legal in very limited circumstances. But the president of Chile right now is quite pro-life. And so in order to ensure that the pro-life politicians didn't back down from their promises, they ended up hosting some massive rallies in the capital city. And I had about a dozen different videos that I could have chosen from, because I interviewed a few of the leaders down there before the rally happened. And then afterwards, I thought this one was the coolest. It's called Voice of the Unborn. That's my English translation. I'm not even going to attempt the Spanish because it's embarrassing. But they basically had lineups of women with their megaphone held to their pregnant stomach, so they said the babies could speak for themselves. So polling after this, it turned out only 14% of Chileans actually believed abortion was a right, and the Chilean president came out and announced that he would work even harder to enshrine preborn rights in the Chilean constitution and essentially work with the pro-life movement to start building a culture of life there, even more complete than the one that they already have. So the attempt to get abortion legalized there actually backfired. What they're actually finding in a lot of these countries is that the vast majority of people just sort of ignore what's going on in politics and live their lives, raise their families. They've got better things to do than hang out on Twitter all day. And so when abortion is actually put forward as something that could actually pass, the politicians in their bubble realize, wait a minute, the public doesn't support these things. And so often you don't realize how pro-life these countries are and how opposed to abortion people are until the abortion activists push for legalization. And that brings all of the people out of their cities, their villages, their towns to protest this and to push back against this. And so I could give you another couple of dozen examples of what's going on globally speaking. What's been really encouraging for us, even at CCBR, is to partner with organizations around the world who are noticing what we're doing here in Canada and asking if we can help them with their strategy there. So earlier this year, after I gave some presentations in the Netherlands, I met with pro-life leaders from Switzerland, from Austria, and we were talking about what they were doing, what we were doing, to try to find out what was applicable in different cultural contexts. We wanted to see how they were doing apologetics and talking to university students. They wanted to see how we were doing it. And really interestingly, a ton of the European pro-lifers wanted to launch a youth movement. So a new organization started there in February, I believe it was February of this year, because it started like 6 weeks before I met with the new executive director, Manuela Steiner, who was working with the youth wing of the Austrian pro-life movement at that time. And they want to start getting campus clubs set up all the way across Europe. This is very normal here in Canada and in the United States, but there is almost no pro-life student movement in Europe. So they started this new organization called Pro-Life Europe. And then after meeting with them, I brought them samples of our literature, our assisted suicide apologetics, our pro-life apologetics. They actually asked me to come back and speak at the Austrian March for Life and then give a training session and meet with their leaders for a couple of days and do strategy. And the march there was pretty incredible. They only started this march a couple of years ago. Well, Vienna told them they couldn't have the march, so they sued the city, and the city said they would back down. So they were allowed to have the march. But from the first year, they had, I think, 1,200 people. They had 5,000 people there only 3 years in. They shut down the whole city center, and there was, I think, 24 protesters. I counted, just because I was sure the media would lie about the contrast. They're really good at finding 3 pro-choice activists and then taking the picture at such an angle that it looks like there's an enormous horde. And they're usually good with the pro-life movement of taking the picture at such an angle that you have one person off to the side. And so I took my own pictures, and even the Austrian media had to point out that it was strange to them that so many people were joining the pro-life movement. And people often ask me, what is it actually about the pro-life movement that is attracting so many young people? Because I'll admit, it seems counterintuitive in some ways. And here's where, again, not going too far down the culture war rabbit hole, but I do think that the, in many ways, depressing state of our culture is one of the reasons that so many young people are joining the pro-life movement. Like, I remember hearing a lot of conversations growing up about how the world was going to hell and everything was so terrible. And one of the things you feel as a young person listening to that is you feel totally helpless to actually do anything. And so it not only breeds apathy, but you just sort of feel depressed about the whole thing. And I remember the first time I ever spoke to somebody about abortion after getting an 8-hour training session from apologetics leaders. The first time I saw somebody change their mind, it was probably one of the most ecstatic experiences I had up to that point, because I'm like, wait a minute, like, we see the abortion issue and the politicians are in charge of it and there's nothing we can do. And you know how this goes, right? The politicians say it's a religious issue, so they can't touch it. And a lot of religious leaders will say, well, it's a political issue, so we can't touch it. And so nobody touches it. They all pass the buck back and forth. And we all resign ourselves to the idea that nothing can be done. And the first time I realized that actually by getting out there using very simple arguments, something could be done, it was so empowering. And since then, I've seen it happen hundreds and hundreds of times, but it is in our power to change the culture. But we have to get out there and talk to people who don't think the same way as us. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there a little bit, have awkward conversations. Jonathon Van Maren will be telling you guys about tomorrow morning. Very simple tactics. You can establish common ground and see people change their minds. Because we do live in a post-Christian culture. And so a lot of people will say we live in a post-Christian culture, and as a result of that, there's no way we can shift the culture. But you're forgetting something when you reach that conclusion immediately. It is a post-Christian culture, which means the generation of young people on the streets that we're talking to weren't the ones who rejected the pro-life worldview to begin with. The previous generation totally rejected Judeo-Christian culture. They totally rejected the pro-life worldview. They were the ones who brought abortion in. The people that we talk to in front of the high schools, even a lot of the people we talk to on the campuses, this is just what they grew up with. This is just something that was there when they were born. And when you talk to them, you would be surprised at how open-minded a lot of these people are. And the second point that's really important to make is that the generation that fought for the legalization of abortion said that it was about liberty and about freedom. They were liberating themselves. This generation, who was born the full brunt of the sexual revolution, this generation, many of them who have experienced abortions at ages as young as 13, they know that it's not freedom and liberation. They know abortion isn't something to celebrate. At the most, it's a necessary evil. Well, we've talked to people in front of high schools where you tell them what this is all about. I remember one 17-year-old girl I was talking to, and she said, "Why has nobody ever told me any of this before?" We have a lot more of an open door than we think, because we're not talking to those who spent their lives fighting to bring in what we are now fighting to remove. We are talking to their children and their grandchildren, and many of them have a very different perspective on this issue than you might think. And when we're speaking to that generation, we do get to see incredible things happen. That's why, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there is a huge difference between the political culture in this country and the actual culture on the ground, which is why, and the reason I'm using this picture is because when we posted it on Twitter, just for fun, because we thought it was a cool picture, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada melted down for several hours, which just, I had to retweet it several times. But the reason they can't stand this picture, their comment was, it's bad enough that people hold these retrograde anti-choice views. To add insult to injury, a lot of them are females who don't know what's good for them. Now, I don't know how much they know about millennials, but being told that somebody else knows what's good for them is not generally a winning strategy. And what we've seen on the streets is that people, when they realize they have the ability to affect change, it's been an incredible experience for them. And so I'm going to show you one video clip that a few of you might have seen. These are just testimonies from my colleagues, the sorts of things we see on the streets. And I'm not kidding, the sort of thing we see on the streets 6 days a week. And these are the sorts of things that we can see happening right across Canada and rebuilding a culture of life.
Well, during choice change, I was holding an image of an 11-year-old aborted child. Two boys walked up to me and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "This is what an abortion looks like." I then asked them if they believed in human rights, and they said, "Of course we do." And after talking about human rights for a bit, they both agreed that an abortion is a human rights violation because it kills a child. And they walked away completely pro-life.
I was doing choice change in the high school in Calgary, and in the span of the lunch hour, I literally spoke to 35 students who had never thought about the issue of abortion before. And by the end of my conversations with them, every single one of them realized that abortion was a human rights violation.
While doing choice change in downtown Windsor, I spoke to a woman named Christine, who shared with me that she thought abortion was wrong in all cases except for sexual assault. And she then mentioned how she just left the courthouse where she was dealing with her own sexual assault case, and she wasn't sure if she was pregnant or not. So Christine wanted to know, what did I think about that? I told Christine how valuable her life is, and how we as a society need to do more to care for women like her who have been through such a traumatizing experience. I then showed her how valuable the life of a preborn child was as well, and that they are deserving of their human rights. Christine smiled at me and said, "Wow, you really struck a chord in me." We shook hands, and she went on her way. Not knowing that Anne had already spoke to her, I asked her again what she thought about abortion. And looking across the street, she said, "Anne changed my mind." She went on her way. While doing activism, I asked the woman walking by what she thought about abortion. She then pointed to a cute little boy in her stroller. She told me that she was going to get an abortion, but chose not to after seeing our signs and talking with us. Little Noah is alive today because his mother saw what abortion really does to preborn children.
I was recently doing activism in downtown Hamilton when a young woman approached me and said, "I saw you guys here last week, and I was going to get an abortion, but after seeing the pictures of aborted children, I changed my mind. I'm keeping my children."
I got a lot of questions after the election, and just from people who read my blog with frequency that's not positive for their mental health. How I managed to stay encouraged despite the fact that there are so many awful things going on. And the answer to that is the video that you just saw. Is that there are bad things that are happening every day. There are also good things that are happening every day. And what we have to realize is that when we look back at history, in all times and in all places, good and evil are fighting. Our times are no different. The evils might look different. They might look more widespread. But at the end of the day, we do have a choice about whether or not to align ourselves with the side of good or to sit back and just let evil take the day. Because there's nothing that the abortion activists would like better than for a whole room full of us to just sit inside a hotel room and talk to each other. Then to take all the training, take all the knowledge, but keep it to ourselves, not share it with our peers, not share it with the people that we know. That's what they want, because then it's easy. They don't mind if we talk to each other. They mind it when we talk to other people, because as their censorship attempts prove, they realize that when people actually hear the truth, they are shocked. Many times they are angry. We see them change their mind and cancel their abortion all the time. This year, by the end of the year, CCBR will have hopefully reached 4 million views of abortion victim photography across the country. God willing, next year we hope to reach 6 million. We're having conversations with people right across the country. We had one office in 2011. We have 6 now. Right across the country, we're having these conversations. And our polling data, and we used the same pollster that a lot of the MPs use, just in case anybody said, well, your numbers aren't accurate. So then I could say, well, then yours aren't either. As we use the same guy. And that polling agency, once they reviewed the impact of abortion victim photography on those who saw it, said that 67% of people who viewed an image of an aborted baby felt more negatively about abortion exclusively because of what they saw. You might ask, why did this result in the Liberals getting another minority government? The answer to that question is actually very simple. What the pro-life movement has thus far failed to do and needs to do is to create a coalition across this country with all of the people who hold the same views we do. Because we were going door to door in ridings filled with new Canadians, Syrian refugees, different ethnic and religious communities, people who've only been in Canada for a decade, and almost without exception, the people that answered the door were pro-life. We had a hard time getting through some neighborhoods in Brampton because we kept on getting invited in for dinner. We had people chasing us down the road, giving us water bottles, which if you're in downtown Oakville or a different neighborhood, they're probably more likely to get thrown at you. But the point is that the people who are voting for the Liberals are not actually on board with his abortion agenda. And it is up to us to work door by door, and I'm not going to pretend that this is easy. Going door to door, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, high school by high school, it's really hard work. You'll have really exhausting conversations. People have been through horrible things in their lives, so you're often going to have draining conversations that make you lose sleep. But what I am saying is that it's very possible. And the reason I know this is because this short video could have played for hours, and all of you eventually would have gotten bored and gone home. We are seeing that change, and if every single one of us commits to speaking to those who don't agree with us and shifting their mind, we will see change. I see change all the time. And every single testimony we get, eventually those will begin turning into data points on a trend. That's what we're working towards. That's what we're seeing happen around the world. That's what we're seeing happening here as well. And I hope that all of you, if you're not already, I see many familiar faces here, if you're not already part of the movement, make the decision to join it this weekend. Thank you so much.